again, my name is Estelle, and the slides are up on my GitHub, and they will be up there forever. And the word to remember is accessibility performance. A11Y is an acronym basically for accessibility because there are 11 letters between the A and the Y. So far my deck is working. My name is Estelle. I am fun employed, which means I am unemployed except for I work my ass off. Most recent book is CSS The Definitive Guide, which is the last one. Wrote it with Eric Meyer. It is a short 1,054 pages. It really should be called CSS The Good Parts because we omitted a lot of stuff. Otherwise, it would have been like twice the size of the Bible. Let's make this bigger. So I'm going to talk about performance and accessibility and how basically using web standards you can make your site accessible and fast. So I'm going to talk about issues and the prescriptive solutions to those issues, and then features, some features that I had to create and the solutions that I discovered that were actually very performant and completely accessible without any additional work on my part. So let's talk about accessibility. This is not the computer crashing. This is actually a black screen with the word click here. If you're using a screen reader and you don't put relevant text inside your links and you just write read more, read more, read more, or click here, click here, click here, that is what the screen reader user hears. That's not good user experience. I'm going to play this really awesome video, and I think you guys are going to find it really, really funny if it plays. It won't play. I didn't think about video not playing. It plays. Okay, so tell me if you think it's hysterical. I'll play it again. Isn't that the funniest video ever? Can anyone read their lips? He says yes to everything. So here we are all, we all have auditory impairments right now. There are no subtitles. We can't hear it. The audio is off, or it's off by default actually on this video. This is what it sounds like to someone who is deaf, or someone whose headset is broken, or someone who is listening to a video at work and doesn't want anyone to know it, right? Subtitles, very important to improve accessibility. Let's actually turn the audio on. Oh.
What were you doing on Tinder to begin with? You got a point.
Okay.
What the fuck? What were you doing on Tinder to begin with? You got a point.
Okay, so basically it says, Kermit, what were you doing on Tinder in the first place? It's got a point. What the fuck? Okay, so it is kind of funny, but wouldn't it be better with subtitles? Who here can read all 5 circles? There's a number in each of those 5 circles. Okay, so I can't read that well, the one in the middle. I think it's the number 2. Okay, so I can read all of them, apparently. This is impossible to read if you have certain types of color blindness, and also hard to read if you have cognitive disabilities. So these are things we need to think about, because disability is a mismatch between the current state of your body right now and the current environment in which you find yourself in. So at times, all of us are colorblind. When you are looking at your phone in the sun, or if I'm looking at my my camera sideways with my sunglasses on, I cannot read it. I cannot see it because of my current environment. I don't have, other than having to wear old person glasses, I have 20/20 vision. I'm older than I look, which is really, really old. So in the United States, 26 years ago, we passed the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, but every country, almost every country, has passed a similar international policy on accessibility. What we did to benefit people in wheelchairs also benefited people on bicycles, on skateboards, pushing the tram or baby stroller, or me pulling my suitcase, because I don't ever do the middle one, but I do the one on the right every week. So things that benefit people with disabilities benefit actually your average users as well. So disability is a spectrum. It can go from being permanently disabled such as being a paraplegic and having no use of your legs or your arms or any of your extremities, to being fully blind, to being completely deaf, to just simply forgetting your headphones one day when you're at work, or being at the airport and not being able to hear over the loudspeaker, to wearing stilettos and not being able to walk in deep grass, to having the sun glare, or just being distracted, or having a broken arm, or holding your baby, right? You have fewer arms. Didn't everyone notice when I wanted to type before, I had to put my thing up here and type like this? Right? Okay. So we have something called accessible rich internet applications. And that is a spec that helps us make things, add accessibility features when we need to. But the interesting thing is, the first rule of ARIA, or accessible rich internet applications, is you don't use ARIA. If you can find a semantic element that serves its purpose, HTML is accessible. Use HTML and supported attributes rather than using ARIA. Let's talk about performance before we go on to continuing. I showed this slide earlier today, and I assume that everyone was in my talk. But it basically said that websites have increased 6-fold in the past 7 years. I just decided to show the layout slightly differently so that you could see, like, videos have gone up like crazy, images have gone up like crazy, scripts have increased 6-fold, right? So we have prescriptions to fixing this problem, and I talked about it earlier. I talked about all of these, which are image optimization techniques. I talked about video optimization, so if you weren't in my talk earlier today, please do take a look at that video. And I talked a little bit about the prescriptive solutions. In those prescriptive solutions, what I didn't mention earlier is that they actually have prescriptions for improved user experience, such as configuring the viewport, using legible font sizes, and basically things that improve usability, not just performance on input and how long the page takes to load. Similarly, in accessibility, there are prescriptive solutions, such as using the alt attribute for all of your images, never relying on color, because I showed you a slide about color blindness. People with color blindness or cognitive disabilities, or people who have low vision, it's not enough to just show 2 different colors to inform them that something is important. Use something else. Use HTML and CSS. That's what they're there for. Declare the language. If you're going to have something that is timed, like a quiz, there are people who have PTSD, and they will freak out if they have a limited amount of time. And there's people who have motor disabilities, and it takes them longer to reach for that tiny little button or however they're accessing it. So make sure that if something is time sensitive, that you handle alternatives for people who need them. Basically, those 14 rules on the previous page from 1998 were rewritten in 2008, but all of them still stand. But they were put into 4 categories of being poor. I'm trying to come up with an acronym called RICH instead, because even though this is like pouring a cup of water, your content needs to be perceivable, your site needs to be operable, your UI needs to be easy to understand, and everything needs to be coded in a robust way so that it can be accessible on any device, whether that is your watch, your computer, your car, or assistive technology like a TTY device, which is teletype, or a screen reader. Right up here in the corner, there's a link to a cool little poster that you can print up and put on your desk, which actually gives 14 tips, design rule tips. So I recommend downloading that. So a few tips. Use the browser defaults, as in HTML and CSS, as much as possible. If you are going to force state with JavaScript, the problem is you have to always manage state. Once you take a div and say that that div is selectable, you have to actually enable it to get focus with the tab as well as the mouse and the keyboard. So if you are messing with JavaScript, just realize you have to manage focus. And so we've been doing user agent sniffing for many, many years. It is not the same as, there is no such thing as assistive technology sniffing. You will hopefully never be able to tell if someone is using a screen reader. Because the people who are using screen readers, the only place in the world where they are not seen by their disability, or at least, you know, a view, that the only place where they are seen to be without disabilities is when they're behind their computer, because no one sees that they are visually impaired and using assistive technology. So hopefully we will never invade their privacy in that manner. So far we can't. The thing to note, let me see if I can make this bigger, is that the thing to note is that by default, HTML is accessible. It is our jobs as developers to not mess with that. HTML is accessible. Use it. That is basically, if you're going to have one takeaway from this talk, everything I'm saying today is to basically say, use HTML. But I made a 1-hour talk around it, or 45 minutes. So let's continue. Some of the issues. This is a website that I showed earlier. I just showed the flame chart. This is Visa's checkout. It is a form. There are 3 form controls: email, password, and a checkbox. I actually showed this website earlier today as a site that is not performant. That's pretty pathetic. A form with 3 form controls. There's a link up there to create account and a submit button. And 2 links for more information there, or 1 to clear. Is 670-something kilobytes. The reason it is so huge and has a 2-second DOM content loaded event is because they use what I call RDD, or resume-driven development. There's 43 dependencies on that form that is 3 items long. They use a post-processor. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a pre-processor or a post-processor. Go ahead and use them. But you should be the one using the pre-processor. The processor should not be in control. So this was part of their CSS. Can anyone see what's wrong with this CSS? Inside their WebKit keyframe, which is targeted to Blink and WebKit devices, right? Which you no longer need because all WebKit now supports unprefixed. They have opacity 1, and their post-processor says, oh, opacity, let me convert the opacity to a Microsoft filter. Anything that needed a filter in IE doesn't understand animation. And this would never be hit by a Microsoft browser anyway because it's only targeted with the WebKit prefix. So this is what a post-processor is doing. This is adding bloat, and it's pissing me off. So anyway, this is their flame chart. And they have that 2-second DOM content loaded event. This is on the fastest connection possible. It's a regular device over regular Wi-Fi. Or actually, better than that. It's IE11 on, I can't see what it's running. But it has 794 kilobytes. I'm sorry, so 0.8 megs. So let's see if I can get out of this here. I can't. Hold on a second, please. There. I'm just going to shrink this up so that... There. OK. So guess what I did? I recoded it. I recoded their entire app in under 2 weeks working part-time because I worked there and I gave notice because I hated the project. And this was my version. It works, right? It does what theirs does. I can tab through this. Right now I'm hitting the right and left arrow, and now I'm hitting the up and down arrow. Okay? So basically it works. I got an F because I did not cache static content, but I didn't care because my whole page to DOM content loaded was 0.82 seconds. And my DOM content loaded event, I don't see it because it was so quick, because there's no need for JavaScript in this page, because it's a form with 3 form controls, and it doesn't do anything fancy other than the footer opening, right? Okay, here's a web page test. Look at it. Mine was fully loaded after 1 second. We can navigate to the side here and see where it comes in at 4 seconds. So I don't think my site is actually that fast. I just think theirs is really, really slow, because they kept 43 dependencies. And to me, a dependency when you don't need one is like scaffolding, right? Scaffolding, you actually need it when you build the bridge, but you don't put the bridge into production and tell people, oh, fine, use my bridge if there's still scaffolding. You take out all the extra pieces that you didn't really need. So use frameworks. I'm not saying don't use frameworks, but you should have a 10-minute, you should be able to argue for 10 minutes why you need to include something. If you can't, if it's just because I want to, not a good reason. So I'm not saying don't do it, but only include something that's going to add bloat if you need to use it. So how did I develop this whole really complex three form control form and make it so quick? Let me just go back here and see. My total was 68 kilobytes, so less than 1/10 of their size, right? Okay, so my solution. Page not loading is my first, a talk I gave in 2012 called You Don't Need a Framework for That. Because my first framework, which is also not loading, but you know what? I was really smart. Close your eyes if you have, if you can't deal with this. Okay, there it is. So you don't need a framework for that. This was my first framework. It was to create this thing that worked in Netscape 4 and IE5. This is tableless, and this was done in 2003, which was pretty good for back then. And this was my framework. It said var is HTML, is ID, is all, or is layers, because I basically needed to test to see if I could use ID, I could use DHTML, or if I needed to use all or layers, or if it was Netscape 4. Those were my options, and that's what. So the reason I needed a framework, right, was because I needed to even out these 4 browsers that just had different features. All the evergreen browsers now have the same features, so you don't need to put jQuery in, for the most part, because everything that jQuery was really helping us with 6 years ago, 8 years ago, was making all the browsers behave the same. So this project was pulling in jQuery so that it could pull in jQuery input mask, which is basically a mask. And here it says DDMMYY. And if I type in 5, it says 05051999. So it kept the letters there, right there. It kept the Y. But 2 things with this was, one, it was pulling in, had to pull in at jQuery, and it had to put in jQuery input mask. So you're talking about 70 kilobytes, which is bigger than my entire application, right? Mine was 68. So just to do this input masking, you were pulling in dependencies that were bigger than my entire project. So I came up with a different way of doing it. I thought to myself, how can I not use a framework to do this? So here is my version of it. Added bonus, I can make it any color I want. So right now it's pink, and I'm going to make it green. Right? You saw the color change. Light blue. Okay. So you can see that it changed colors. And then if I type in 544, not only did it keep the mask, it added the slash, and turned red when it was not valid. You see how it's blue, and very light blue in the back. Zip code. In the US, the zip codes are 5 digits, so I'm going to type 5 digits, and that works. If I try to enter a Y, it does not work. And then if I want to copy and paste this, I can hit Control-C and Control-V, and that works. So it's pretty robust, right? So how did I do this? It's actually 3 kilobytes instead of 2, because I auto-initialized it, which added some features to it. Before I go into that, I just want to cover HTML inputs. This is the support chart for HTML inputs. There's input type text, search URL, and telephone, email, password, date, month, week, time, date, time, local, number, range, color, checkbox, and radio button. Some of these are old school, and I'm sure you use them. Some of them you may not have heard of. Some of you may have heard of, but don't know all their attributes, such as on number. Where's number? Why am I not seeing it? Oh, there it is, right here. It has a min and a max, and it has a property called step. No reason not to use these. They also all have a pattern attribute. Not all of them, like input, radio button, and checkbox don't have a pattern attribute, but most of them do. So what I did is I used basic HTML, and I said to code this, let's first start off with semantic HTML. So when you use my little 3 kilobyte framework for this, all you have to do is do input, and then you give it an ID, which matches the 4 attribute in the label, right? That's what the ID is used for. Type tell, because I want a number keyboard if someone uses this phone or a dynamic keyboard. Name is zip code. The name attribute is how you submit the form. It's brilliant. Some people don't know that. Class is masked is actually the hook for this to work. Then I have a placeholder, which is the text that I want to show, but it is the actual CSS attribute placeholder. I mean HTML attribute. And then I have a pattern, which is a regular expression that says exactly 5 numbers. And then I have a title, 5-digit zip code. So if someone who is sighted and uses a mouse hovers over the input, they will actually see a little thing that says title. A lot of accessibility experts will say don't use title, but I'm going to reuse title. So there's no reason not to add accessibility features. Once the JavaScript is called, this is the code that comes out of it, which is I put a span around it, which I call shell. First element in there is a hidden span, which has a mask. And the way I create the mask is basically I use the word, the ID, because I know that it's going to be unique, or that was unique in the page, and then attach masks, so I know it's different than the actual form control. And then I have an I element, which is just an empty non-semantic element, and then the placeholder. Then I use all of that HTML that you saw before, but I add something. I add ARIA label, and what I did is I grabbed the label. In the JavaScript, I grabbed the label, and I grabbed the title, and I gave it an ARIA label, and that is what will be read to the screen reader. So the thing is, originally it was completely accessible. It said zip code. But I improved it by using ARIA, which was not necessary, right? I added enhanced using ARIA, but I didn't actually need it. So it says the screen reader, when the user hits it, it will say zip code, 5-digit zip code. I could have said something a little bit better and clever. Okay, so that's what comes out. So basically, the important part is the ARIA label, and then the span, ARIA hidden true, idea of zip mask. That is the important part, the 1, 2, 3, and the XXX. So how did this feature work? What I did is the span that is hidden goes, it's now before the input, right? So the span says 1, 2, 3 in italic, and then XX, and the value of the input is now 1, 2, 3. So the value shows as 1, 2, 3, and there's a span behind that input that says 1, 2, 3, XXX. The 1, 2, 3, that what I do with that is I basically say make it transparent, or give it an opacity of 0, or visibility hidden. I don't care which one you do, but it will make that invisible, and it will be the exact same width as the text in the foreground. So you have the text in the foreground, which is the value, and the part that is not in the input. So it's not that complex. There's nothing fancy about this. If you want to use it, there's a GitHub repo. But the reason I'm showing it to you is I saved 67 kilobytes, the entire size of my application, by using this script, right? I didn't pull in jQuery and jQuery input mask. I like jQuery input mask, but I'm using a simple feature. I don't need all the features of jQuery or the input mask feature, so I created my own. What I what I covered a little bit was ARIA label, right? So let me talk a little bit about ARIA and accessibility. The thing you should be using is the one in blue and bold. I didn't use color alone. I also used bold so that if you are colorblind, hopefully you can see it. But that is just a feature of added accessibility, and it's better user experience because you know which line I'm pointing to, right? It catches your eye the most. So the one you want to use is the easiest thing, the one you should always start with, is always have a label for every single one of your form controls, whether it's implicit or explicit. Implicit means that you basically have a label around, the label element around your form control and some text, right? That's implicit. Explicit is when you actually have label opening with text and then closing and then an input control, or the other way around. Either way, when you click, you see how I click on telephone number and it gives focus to that? That's a usability feature that is in your HTML. I didn't have to put any JavaScript to make that work. And that's why I'm saying use HTML. The way it was developed improves user experience and improves accessibility. So the thing you really want to do is do label. If you don't have a label, it will actually, the screen reader will actually read the placeholder. If you don't have a placeholder, it will read the title. If you don't have any of the above, it is not accessible and you are not doing your job correctly and you should not be calling yourself a developer. No, I'm just going a little too deep there. It really pisses me off when people don't do that. If you want to add features and you want to add ARIA, you can also add ARIA label or ARIA labeled by. The order the screen reader picks is ARIA labeled by, which is the ID of one or more elements. So it's basically if you have a label and then you have something else you want it to read, you can use ARIA labeled by. ARIA label, it just reads with the text that's in the label, and that's what I used as an enhancement. I basically put the label plus the title together. Then it will read label. So it will actually, if you use either of the first two, it will read that instead. So that's ARIA accessibility for label. Okay, I don't need this because if you want to see a failed example, why is it a failed example? When you use the virtual DOM, the value of your input is not actually on the screen, it's in the virtual DOM. So when they put this together and someone tried to implement it, they didn't maintain state within the browser. They didn't update the HTML. They only updated the virtual DOM. And so that, the screen reader did not read it, and it did not actually update, and it did not work. Okay. So, second feature. Oh, there's tons of other people who have implemented it, just no one sends me the URL. People have said, oh, I love that. And I'm like, please send me the URL, and they never do. So here, I'm going to hit tab. And you might not have seen it, but the first bullet is selected. I'm going to hit the right arrow. I'm going to hit the left arrow. This is a carousel. It works really well as a carousel, right? It's 3 lines of JavaScript. I'm going to show you those 3 lines. But first I'm going to show you what Visa did. They did this, and they said button class navigation control previous disabled type button. So they have a button of type button with style visibility visible with ARIA ARIA hidden equals true and tab index -1. So they had to maintain state. Then they had an image of with a class of null element for accessibility compliance. I am so confused by this, even though I worked on the team. I have no clue why you would have an image without a source or an alt attribute and why that would help with accessibility. Then they had a div inside a div inside a div, with one of them having the role of option with a tab index of 0 and an ARIA label, and lots of code. I'm not going to go into it because it makes me sad. This is what I did. So I did a field set with a legend, because field set is an element that almost no one uses in HTML, with a legend, which says what the instructions are for the form, for that area of the form. And then I had a label with an address. And then down below, I have a radio button. And the ID here matches the 4 right there, right? This address 1 and that address 1 happen so that when one is selected, when you select a radio button, it works. So to the screen reader, all they're seeing is five labels associated with 5 input buttons. It's a completely accessible, unordered list. And to the sighted user, they have a little carousel, and anyone, screen reader user or sighted user who's using a mouse or a keyboard, can tab through it. You saw, I was telling you I was tabbing, I wasn't lying. So this is the important part. I have a field set with a legend, and then I have an input that has an ID further down that matches the that's the value of the 4 attribute. That's how it works. How did it change direction? What were the 3 lines of JavaScript doing? The 3 lines of JavaScript were adding an event handler that when it changed the value, when the value of the selected button changed, it changed the parent class of the carousel. And the parent class of the carousel was .left0, .left1, .left2, .left3. I used SAS, so I could basically just use this once and use a multiplication, whatever the size of my carousel is, you know, whether it was 4ems or whatever. So basically, let me just go back one. And then I transitioned it over 200 milliseconds. So I just used a CSS transition and a background position, which I should have used translate, but to put this in the middle of the page, to do it in this way without any appearance, I used left instead of transform. I would use transform translate instead. So the accessibility features of this carousel are it uses the appropriate semantic elements to select a form control, right? The label describes the purpose of the selection. The states of on and off are distinguishable. I would have needed to better manage which radio button is selected. I'm not a graphic designer for a reason. Keyboard access is supported, and focus state should be a little bit more clearly visible, but is clearly visible if you're a better designer than I am. So it is a carousel. It matches the structure, functionality, the animation, and the styling requirements of, this is web accessibility. These are the requirements for a carousel. Here's another version of it. It's a carousel of carousels, which I thought was very meta. The only thing is, it's not actually a carousel. I had this tested with screen reader users, and they said, but this isn't a carousel. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it works. They could access it. They just was like, I have all the information. I don't have any extra information read to me. There's no information missing. It works, so it's not a carousel. So I called it merry-go-round. It's a limited carousel because inside a label, you cannot put an input, right? You couldn't put a button inside the label part because the button, you just can't put a button inside the label unless it's an implicit and it's for that button. And you can't put links inside the label because if you click on the label, it goes to the input, it can't go to the link. So you could actually put it in and it would just be terrible usability, so no, don't do that. So it's limited in the information it can do, but it can hit about 90% of your carousel use cases. Because in this case right here, if you hit enter, it will actually send you to Flickr. So if you actually hit enter with the keyboard, it would actually go to that page. So you can use it if you want your whole carousel to go someplace. I mean, if you want the page to navigate someplace else. So that's called merry-go-round. Another feature I have is this right here. And I'm going to pick Canada, and you're going to see the Canadian flag right there on the bottom, right down there. And I moused over it. So I'm going to pick another one. I'm going to pick Australia. And now you have the Australian flag down there. So how did I do that? Let's first talk about how they did it. They used a framework, and the framework that they used was 39 kilobytes. Oh no, it was 6 kilobytes, which I don't believe, because Dropkick Min.js actually does a lot of other stuff. I think I made a mistake. I think it's actually 58 kilobytes, but I'll have to go back and check. It could be 5.8. So, but the thing is, in terms of accessibility, they had to put all the accessibility features back in instead of using something native HTML. So they added 6 kilobytes, jQuery as a requirement, and then they had to do role, listbox, ARIA label, section, role option. Why not just use an option, right? Tab index -1, so they had to maintain state. And then they had to update whichever one was ARIA selected with true. How did I do it? Anyone want to guess? Radio buttons. I love radio buttons. I use the field set again with a legend of select your country. And it's an input type radio with an ID and a label that goes along with that with the word Australia. And you know exactly what this does, right? You're basically selecting a country. This is semantic. This, I had to kind of explain to you. This one, I can use the keyboard to navigate it. This one, I have to use JavaScript to enable navigation through the options. This one, I have to maintain tab index. This one, the browser does it for me. There basically was no JavaScript needed for this one. The only thing that JavaScript does, oh, I didn't even put it in here. There's a click event on the footer. When you click on the footer, it opens up the footer. It changes the class from footer closed to footer open. And the field set has a transform of 1, 0, which means it's 100% of the length of the original and 0% of the height. And it goes to 1, 1, which means it opens up this way. And then the neat trick is footer label active, label focus, label hover, and the label that comes after the input that is checked, using CSS selectors there, has the dotted border and the different color background. So basically what I did is I just thought outside of the box and made something way simpler. Their framework, actually, the one they put in, does autocomplete, but there is no autocomplete. These are options, right? You have a list of 14 countries. You're not typing in the letter J and getting Jamaica. You're selecting from 14. So their framework that they use, I'm not saying don't use that. If you actually need a form control that does autocomplete, use data list. But if you can't use data list because you don't know what data list is, or you don't want to, or you need some additional features, then use dropclick. I'm not saying don't use it, but don't use it for something so simple, because all it does is add bloat. So basically the general idea is think outside the box and remove that scaffolding before you go into production. And when you need it, there is ARIA. There is accessible rich internet applications. There are all sorts of roles and other attributes that you can add to your HTML when needed. But just remember that you shouldn't be using ARIA. If you don't, I mean, you should be using ARIA anyway. You can use it anyway. But don't use it as a crutch. Use it as an enhancement. And that's all I have. And I have 5 minutes left if anyone has any questions. Oh, these are some resources as well. And also one other thing. I'm putting together a conference. So if you want to convince your bosses to let you go to San Francisco in March, our weather is perfect, by the way. I'm doing a performance conference there, and we have Paul Irish, Jem Young, and Marcy Sutton as speakers. Any questions? I hear there's a fun box, and the microphone might work.
Yeah, there is. And
oh,
also
wait. Everyone applaud the microphone.
Yes. Nothing went wrong. Yay.
And the screen.
You have 15 more minutes if you want.
15?
This is a 55-minute talk.
I do?
You do.
I mean, I cut that much out?
Yeah.
Okay. What else would you like me to teach you?
Anybody? Any question? We have an expert here. Just go nuts.
Do you talk more after you drink?
Because I
gave a CSS workshop in New Zealand, and no one said a word during the whole workshop. And I said, I'm not going to continue until you ask questions. And so I forced them to. And then we had drinks, and then they wouldn't shut up. So what's your question?
Web technologies instead of the hype of frameworks.
Okay, so the question was, what do I do to convince young developers?
What arguments do you use? Yeah.
Okay, so the thing is, I actually try to convince senior developers that they're not, that to be a senior developer, my take is that if you know JavaScript, you can learn any framework. So say you need 3 years of React, or say you need 3 years of Angular, That doesn't make you a senior developer. That makes you a pro at Angular or a pro at React. But you might not know how to actually code JavaScript. Now, I'm not a pro at React, and I'm not a pro at Angular, and I avoid them like the plague. So I probably could not find a job. Actually, I did. I got a job offer last week, and I need to decide whether I want to take it. But what makes someone a senior web developer to me is someone who can mentor other people, someone who understands the separation of concerns, someone who knows that accessibility is important, someone who knows that performance is important, someone who knows that the user experience comes before developer experience. So the thing with resume-driven development is it puts developer experience before the user experience. Developing, like learning new technologies is really, really fun. But that is the scaffolding. Pull it out. You can learn all the new tricks while you're developing, while you're prototyping. But don't put that stuff into production, because that is putting your needs of developing faster or developing your resume instead of your project over the user experience of having a fast website that works, whether you are sighted or whether you're using assistive technologies, or whether your mouse is broken. A lot of people don't think about the broken mouse, and a lot of people don't think about touch on the phone and reaction time. So how do I teach young people? In college, they don't learn the frameworks, and they also don't spend enough time learning the semantics. So I try to convince more advanced developers that they need to convince, because junior developers need to be mentored. And it's the more experienced developers that need to be convinced so that they can actually change their working environment to improve semantics. Because you can't, teaching accessibility, teaching performance basically teaches people that they need to think about other things other than their framework. I hope that answered your question. Basically, I'm failing miserably, which is why I'm up here talking about it. So that I can
delegate it to others, right?
Right?
No,
Yeah.
I'm joking.
Any other questions?
Anybody have any questions?
I'm going to go into another talk if you don't ask me a question.
I'll ask you a question. Have you ever worked with disabled people, like colleagues, disabled colleagues?
So, who here has a disability? Who here wears glasses?
Yeah, that guy.
Who here wears glasses? Okay. You're partially visually impaired. If you don't have your glasses, you can't see. I wear glasses. I don't wear glasses to see you. I've celebrated my 29th birthday many times. I wear what I call granny glasses. And if you're not my age, granny glasses are awesome. They're just magnifiers, and they help you so you can see the needle better, and you can see details. They're awesome. But I can't actually see you if I have them on, because it's really just to see me threading the needle. So everyone has a disability at some point in time. Have I worked with people with permanent disabilities? Yes. I have worked with some people who are completely blind, and I've worked with people who are partially blind. And an interesting thing is, when the iPad came out, I knew someone who had never read a book before, actually read a book, and they were severely visually impaired, but they could still see. And so with the iPad, they could touch the screen and increase it, and they could put it close to their face, and they could scroll left to right and actually read. So for the first time in their life, they read a non-Braille book. So it's things that we don't actually think about. We think about the screen reader, but we don't think about the fact that when I'm watching a TV show, who here uses closed captioning when they're watching TV shows?
Everything's subtitled here.
Right, but for me, oh, my talk's over. For me, I'm American and I'm watching a TV show in English, and I have no clue what the joke was, and I missed it, and it's in English 3 seconds later, and I'm like, oh, that wasn't actually that funny. I don't know why people are joking, laughing in the background, because we use canned laughter to say, oh, you were supposed to laugh. But at least I can see. So that's closed captioning is for people with who are deaf or hard of hearing. And as someone who has no problem hearing, on the contrary, it's really weird. I can hear conversations that are really, really far away. but I can't always hear my television because I'm not paying attention. It's an enhancement that helps people who don't have hearing impairments.
Thank you.
Okay, who wants to learn about selectors or
Anybody?
Flexbox?
Anybody else have any questions? No catch? All right, I'll come over.
So I was in your previous talk, and
Yeah.
you talked about eco-friendliness
Okay.
as part of JavaScript. Can you please say a bit more about it?
Okay, so the eco-friendliness is the idea that you're draining someone's battery. So when you saw the 2-second DOM content loaded event, that was draining the battery. So just to fill you in, I call it eco-friendliness because it is eco-friendly. You're using less energy. You have to think, when you're developing, you now have to think about how much of someone's battery power you're consuming. Who here uses Waze, W-A-Z-E? Do you even have that in this country? It is the best thing ever. It tells you where the traffic is. It's like Google Maps, but with all the traffic, and it tells you when there's police officers who are stopping people for speeding, and it tells you where there's accidents, and it tells you, like, don't go this way, actually take a side street. Totally worth the battery drain, right? I know my battery is draining when I'm using it because it is a native app on my phone. When I am visiting Disney.com, I don't actually think that Disney.com is going to drain my battery. But Disney.com is like, it used to be like 25 megabytes. I think they brought it down to like 6. It animates, it's downloading, it's running my CPU. It might not be doing that anymore. This is a few years ago when I looked at it. I never went back because I'm like, I don't want to drain my website on someone's crappy website. When you're watching a video on your phone, you know you're draining your website. But you as developers, you could go ahead and drain someone's website, but don't be a jerk. Think about the fact that you're using up the battery. So what uses up the battery? When you repaint the page, usually you're doing a reflow. That reflow uses up the battery. When you are doing an AJAX request to fetch some JSON to check to see how many Facebook likes you have or how many retweets you have through a third-party widget, you are actually waking up the radio. So the thing that uses the most power on your mobile device is the light, like having the screen on. The second thing is waking up that radio. And the third thing is basically running JavaScript or other applications that are basically using up energy and running the CPU. Because when you're running the CPU, you're draining the battery. So when that website that I just showed you has, what was it, almost 800K, 794K of total, and 600K of that was JavaScript, that JavaScript needs to be downloaded, which all JavaScript needs to be downloaded, but it needs to be parsed and executed. And that parsing and executing drains the battery. So every time you're running JavaScript, you're draining the battery. So there is actually a slide, like the third to last slide, but because I had so much technical difficulties, my talk ran long. But the third to last slide is everything that will drain the battery.
Any other questions?
Okay, I have a few more minutes, so I'm going to go over specificity. What's one thing I can teach you that people think they know, but they don't necessarily know? It's specificity. Who here wants to learn about specificity? Everyone raise your hand. Okay, thank you. So, CSS specificity. The C in CSS stands for cascade. And a lot of people put their CSS inline because they don't fully understand the cascade. So the way that that CSS is weighted is the universal selector has specificity with a value of 0. So the specificity is 0 for ID, 0 for class, and 0 for element, but it is still a specificity of 0, which is different than having no specificity. An element selector has a specificity of 0-0-1. So if you have 27 element selectors, which you shouldn't have, it would be 0-0-27. A single class will outweigh no matter how many elements you have. And by element selector, I mean an element like body, div, article, section, or something like before and after, or first line or first letter. Those are pseudo elements. They have a specificity of 0-0-1. A class selector has a specificity of 0-1-0. That means a single class will outweigh any element selector. But it's not just classes as in .myClass, it is actually pseudo-classes. So if you use the attribute selector, that is a pseudo-class, or has the weight of a pseudo-class. Anything with a single colon, like only of type, nth of type 7n, that'll make your selection more specific, but it does not add to the specificity. I mean, it adds just one class to the specificity. No matter how many classes you have, a single ID will overwrite the specificity of 27 to 254 classes. It should actually be higher than that, but some browsers break at that point. But if you're using 254 classes, you should not be a web developer. There's a lot of times where I say you should not be a web developer. There's many other jobs out there. So if you don't do as I say, no, I'm kidding. So here, like this one right here, input type, that's one element right there. One value as a class. It's an attribute selector, but it has a value of 0-1-0. The negation selector actually has no value. It's the parameter in here that has the value. So it's 0-1-0, 0-1-0, 0-0-1 for a total of 0-2-1. An ID selector will totally overwrite that. And that is why it's a shark. Because it's okay to use, but it's kind of dangerous. You don't want to kill off all the sharks, but you don't want to have too many swimming in your waters. So you, no matter how many divs you have, or IDs you have, inline style will overwrite all of that. Important will overwrite what's in the style. So you should not have a single important in your code unless you put it into your code the first day and said, this is important, I never want it overwritten, and you have intentionally used it. Do not use it to overwrite someone else's code, because then they can't overwrite it, especially if you're a third-party script. If someone actually, in their third-party thing that you're including, has divitis and uses a div to style it, and you want to overwrite it, whatever their ID is, when I said div, I meant ID. So they've used an ID, and you can't overwrite it, because that's really specific. You know, they've already used the ID. How can you be more specific than that? You can actually do #my div, #my div, #my div with no spaces, and that will have the specificity of 3-0-0. That actually works. You can do the same thing with class. You can do .myClass, 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 and that has the specificity of 0-3-0. Use the lowest specificity that you can. Don't ever use those two hacks that I just shared with you, the myClass, 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 or my ID, my ID, my ID, without putting a comment in your code as to why you did that. A few things to note about specificity are all here on the bottom. The star, the plus sign, the greater than sign, and the tilde, which are known as combinators, the combinators, they can help you make something more specific, but they don't actually increase the specificity. They have no value. And again, the not, right, or in future CSS, like the matches, or actually it's any, no, it's matches, or any. I don't remember which one it is. Maybe it's both. If it has a parentheses, it's and it's not a structural selector, then it's actually the parameter that you pass has the value. And so with matches, which is coming out and supported in all browsers except for IE at this point, but with prefix, you can put many selectors in there. So you could do matches and then say either my div, comma, my class. Whichever one has the highest specificity in that combination is the one that gives it the specificity. One last trick about specificity is if someone actually does use important, you can overwrite it with animations, but don't do that. So that's it on specificity. If you want this sheet and you can print it up and put it over your desk, it's specificity.com.
That's a dirty name.
It has shit in it.
Yeah.
It also has fish in it. And homeowner has meow in it.
That is actually true. I never thought of that.
So it's actually ho, meow, ner.
The things we learned today.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank you very much, Estelle. Thank you.